The bus from Porto to Lagos took most of the day, winding through the Portuguese countryside and eventually reaching the stunning coastline of the Algarve. Peter sat by the window, watching the landscape change from the green hills of the north to the golden cliffs and turquoise waters of Portugal's southern coast. For the first time since leaving Chicago, he felt truly free, no mysterious network to investigate, no ancestral obligations to fulfill, no council meetings or difficult decisions ahead. Just Peter Matthews, a backpack, and the open road. Lagos announced itself with dramatic beauty, a historic port city nestled between towering golden cliffs and the Atlantic Ocean. The old town was a maze of cobblestone streets lined with whitewashed buildings, traditional restaurants, and small shops catering to the surfers and travelers who flocked to the Algarve's famous beaches. Peter found a small hostel in the historic center, choosing a bed in a shared room with 3 other backpackers, a German couple and an Australian surfer who immediately invited Peter to join them for sunset beers at the beach. It was exactly the kind of casual, no-expectations interaction he had been craving after weeks of intense family history and weighty decisions. That evening, as they sat on Praia de Dona Ana watching the sun paint the limestone cliffs in shades of orange and red, Peter felt something settle inside him. The Australian surfer, a guy named Dave, asked the inevitable question, "So mate, what brings you to Lagos?" "Just traveling," Peter replied simply. "Seeing where the road takes me." "Best reason there is," Dave agreed, clinking his beer bottle against Peter's. The next morning, Peter set out to explore the famous rock formations of Ponta da Piedade, the dramatic headland just outside Lagos where centuries of wind and waves had carved the golden limestone into spectacular arches, tunnels, and sea stacks. The tourist brochures called it one of Portugal's most beautiful coastal landscapes, and Peter quickly understood why. The cliffs rose 40 meters above the turquoise water, creating a maze of natural sculptures that seemed almost too perfect to be real. Stairs carved into the rock led down to small grottos where the morning light created magical effects as it filtered through natural windows in the stone. But what caught Peter's attention most was the lighthouse, the Farol de Ponta da Piedade standing sentinel on the headland. Unlike most lighthouses painted white, this one was a distinctive red color that contrasted beautifully with the golden cliffs and blue sky. Peter climbed the path leading to the lighthouse, drawn by curiosity and the magnificent views from the headland. As he approached, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench near the lighthouse base, gazing out at the ocean with the stillness of someone who had spent years contemplating the sea. The man turned as Peter approached, his weathered face breaking into a welcoming smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said in accented English. "I've seen this view every day for 30 years, and it never gets old." "You work here?" Peter asked. "I'm Miguel, the lighthouse keeper, though these days the lighthouse mostly runs itself, automated systems, GPS navigation. My job is mainly maintenance and keeping an eye on things." He gestured to the bench. "Would you like to sit? The view is better shared." Peter sat, and they fell into easy conversation. Miguel had the gift that many solitary people develop, the ability to make visitors feel immediately comfortable while also respecting the quiet spaces between words. "Do you live here?" Peter asked, gesturing to the lighthouse. "In the keeper's cottage, yes. It's small but comfortable, and the rent can't be beat." Miguel's smile was sad. "My wife and I moved here 30 years ago when I got the position. She loved the ocean, loved watching the boats and the changing weather. She passed away 10 years ago, and I suppose I've stayed because leaving would feel like abandoning her memory." "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, but I've made peace with it. The ocean teaches you about change and impermanence. The tides come and go, the storms pass, life continues." Miguel stood and stretched. "Would you like some coffee? I was about to make a pot, and I'd enjoy the company." Peter followed Miguel to the lighthouse keeper's cottage, a small white building attached to the lighthouse tower. The interior was simple but cozy, a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a small bedroom visible through an open door, and walls covered with photographs of ships, sunsets, and a beautiful woman who must have been Miguel's late wife. As Miguel prepared coffee on a small stove, Peter examined the photographs more closely. Many showed the lighthouse itself in different weather conditions and seasons. Others captured the spectacular rock formations of Ponta da Piedade from angles that tourists never saw. "You're a photographer?" Peter asked. "An amateur. But when you live in one of the most beautiful places in Portugal, it's hard not to try to capture it." Miguel handed Peter a cup of strong coffee. "What brings you to Lagos? You have the look of someone who's traveling for reasons beyond tourism." Peter found himself telling Miguel about his journey, not the complicated parts about ancestral networks and inherited legacies, but the simpler truth about leaving a life that wasn't working and trying to figure out who he really was. "Ah," Miguel nodded with understanding. "You're on a pilgrimage of self-discovery. The Algarve is a good place for that. The ocean has a way of putting human concerns in perspective." As they finished their coffee, Miguel's expression became more animated. "You know, there's an old legend about this lighthouse and the rock formations below. The local fishermen used to tell stories about hidden caves that only appear when the tides and moon align in specific ways." "What kind of stories?" Peter asked, intrigued. "They said that centuries ago, when pirates and privateers sailed these waters, the fishermen of Lagos would hide their most precious possessions in sea caves during raids. The caves could only be accessed at the lowest tides of the year, when the moon was at its fullest. The rest of the time, they were completely submerged and invisible." Miguel walked to a shelf and pulled down an old leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my grandfather, who was a fisherman here before the lighthouse was built. He wrote about the caves and even drew a map of where he believed the entrance was. But he also wrote that accessing them was extremely dangerous. The rocks are sharp, the timing has to be perfect, and even a small mistake could be fatal if you're trapped when the tide comes back in." Peter examined the journal, noting the careful Portuguese handwriting and detailed sketches of the coastline. One page showed a map of the rock formations with an X marked in a location that seemed impossible to reach, a narrow passage between two massive sea stacks. "Have you ever tried to find it?" Peter asked. Miguel shook his head. "When I was younger, yes, a few times, but I could never quite reach the spot my grandfather marked, and after my wife died, I lost interest in treasure hunting. What would I do with gold or jewels anyway? You can't take them with you, and I have everything I need here. When does this perfect tide and moon alignment happen?" Miguel checked a calendar on his wall covered with tide tables and lunar phases. His eyes widened slightly. "Actually, tonight. The new moon combined with the spring equinox creates the lowest tide of the year. It only happens for a few hours, between midnight and 3 a.m. Peter felt a familiar pull of curiosity and adventure. "Would you want to try again? With two people, it might be safer. And even if we don't find anything, it would be an adventure." Miguel studied Peter's face carefully. "You're serious? You'd spend your night climbing around dangerous rocks with an old man chasing a legend that's probably just a story? I can't think of a better way to spend a night in Lagos," Peter replied honestly. "And besides, you wouldn't be doing it alone. Two people looking out for each other. What do you think they'll find in the hidden caves? Sometimes the best treasures aren't what we expect." Share your predictions in the comments. Miguel's eyes lit up with something Peter recognized. The spark of adventure that age and routine had dimmed but not extinguished. "All right, but we prepare properly. Good shoes, flashlights, rope, first aid kit. And if at any point it seems too dangerous, we turn back." "Agreed. Agreed." They spent the afternoon preparing for the night expedition. Miguel showed Peter the route they would take down to the rock formations, explaining the specific landmarks they'd need to navigate by in the dark. They checked the weather forecast, clear skies and calm seas, perfect conditions. As evening fell, they ate a simple dinner in the cottage while Miguel told stories about his years as lighthouse keeper. He spoke about ships he'd guided safely to harbor, storms he'd weathered, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived close to the ocean. "You know what I've learned from 30 years in this lighthouse?" Miguel asked as they cleaned up after dinner. "That most people are searching for something grand and dramatic, but the best things in life are usually small and quiet. Perfect sunset, a good conversation, the satisfaction of work well done, connection with another human being. Is that why you've stayed even after your wife passed?" "Partly. but also because leaving would mean admitting that chapter of my life is truly over. As long as I'm here, I can still feel her presence in the cottage, still imagine her sitting on the bench watching the ocean. He paused. But tonight, going on this adventure, it feels like maybe I'm finally ready to create new memories instead of just preserving old ones. At 11 p.m., they dressed in practical clothes, gathered their equipment, and began the descent to the rock formations. The full moon, despite being called a new moon in the tide tables due to its position relative to the sun, provided surprising illumination, painting the limestone cliffs in silvery light. The path down was steep and required careful attention. Miguel moved with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and handhold, while Peter followed his lead. As they descended, the sound of the waves grew louder, and Peter could smell the salt spray and seaweed that characterized the tidal zone. At sea level, the landscape transformed into an otherworldly maze of rock formations. What looked like simple cliffs from above revealed themselves to be complex structures with hidden passages, natural bridges, and pools of water reflecting the moonlight. The tide was indeed extremely low, exposing rock formations that were normally underwater. Miguel led them carefully through the maze, consulting his grandfather's map and occasionally stopping to get his bearings. "This is further than I've ever been able to go," he said after about 20 minutes of careful navigation. "The tide is lower than I've ever seen it." They reached the area marked on the map, a narrow passage between two massive sea stacks that rose like cathedral pillars from the exposed seabed. In the moonlight, Peter could see why this location had been chosen for hiding valuables. It was invisible from both land and sea unless you knew exactly where to look, and it was only accessible for a few hours each year when conditions aligned perfectly. "There!" Miguel pointed to a dark opening in the cliff face, about 2 meters above the current water level. "That must be it. The cave entrance." They used their rope to create a secure line, and Miguel, despite his age, climbed with surprising agility into the opening. Peter followed, and they found themselves in a natural cave carved by centuries of wave action. The ceiling was low, forcing them to crouch, but the space extended back into the cliff further than their flashlight beams could reach. The floor of the cave was covered with sand and small pools of water. As they moved deeper, Peter's flashlight reflected off something that made him stop. Partially buried in the sand were several glass bottles, old ones, sealed with wax and cork. "Miguel, look at this." They carefully excavated several bottles, handling them with reverence. Through the old glass, they could see rolled paper inside documents that had been protected from the sea for who knew how long. Miguel's hands shook slightly as he examined the bottles. "My grandfather was right. The cave is real. Should we open them here or take them back to the cottage?" "The cottage. We need to be careful with anything this old. And we should check the tide. We don't have unlimited time." They gathered 6 bottles total, along with a few other items that had been protected in the cave: old coins, a tarnished silver cross, and what looked like a sailor's knife. But the bottles were clearly the main treasure, carefully hidden and preserved for reasons they would soon discover. The journey back up the cliff was more challenging carrying their finds, but adrenaline and excitement gave them energy. By the time they reached the Lighthouse cottage, it was nearly 2 a.m., but neither man was interested in sleep. Miguel carefully opened the first bottle, using a knife to gently work away the wax seal that had protected it for generations. Inside was a rolled piece of paper, the writing still legible despite its age. "It's a letter," Miguel said, his voice thick with emotion. Dated 1847. He read aloud, "My dearest Maria, if you are reading this, then I have not returned from my voyage, and someone has found this message where I left it for safekeeping. Know that my last thoughts were of you and our children. The small amount of money hidden with this letter is for your future. Tell our sons that their father loved them and that the sea, though it took me, also gave me the life I lived with you. Your husband, Antonio." Peter felt tears in his eyes. This wasn't a pirate's treasure or a smuggler's cache. These were messages from sailors who knew the dangers of the sea and wanted to leave something for their families in case they didn't return. They opened bottle after bottle, each containing similar letters, messages from men who had faced the ocean knowing they might not come home. Some letters included small amounts of money or jewelry, but most were simply words of love and farewell. The fifth bottle stopped Miguel cold. He stared at the name at the bottom of the letter, then looked at Peter with an expression of shock. "This is from my grandfather, João Miguel Silva, dated 1962. But this doesn't make sense. He died in 1965. Why would he leave a letter here?" Miguel read the letter silently, tears streaming down his weathered face. When he finished, he handed it to Peter to read. "To whoever finds this, but especially if it's my grandson Miguel, I leave this message. I have hidden this letter not because I expect to die at sea, but because there are things I need to say that I'm too proud to say in person. I fear I have been a hard man, too focused on work and survival to show love properly. If my grandson Miguel is reading this, I want him to know that I was proud of him every day of his life, even when I was too stubborn to say it. The sea teaches us many things, but it took me too long to learn that the greatest treasure isn't what we accumulate, but the connections we make with the people we love. Don't waste your life hoarding treasures of gold or pride. Spend it freely on love and human connection. João Miguel Silva." Miguel sat in silence for a long moment, the letter trembling in his hands. "I never knew," he finally said. "My grandfather died when I was 20. We had a difficult relationship. He was stern, demanding, never showed affection. I thought he was disappointed in me for not becoming a fisherman like him. But all this time, this letter was here, waiting. He loved you," Peter said simply. "He just didn't know how to show it. And I've spent 30 years in this lighthouse, isolated and alone, when what he wanted was for me to spend my life freely on human connection." Miguel wiped his eyes. "It's not too late though, is it? I'm 70 years old, but maybe it's not too late to live differently." They stayed up the rest of the night, talking about the letters, about Miguel's grandfather, about life and regrets and possibilities. Peter told Miguel more about his own journey, about his grandfather's letters in Coimbra, about the council meeting in Porto, about choosing freedom over inherited obligation. "You made the right choice," Miguel said. "If there's one thing these letters teach us, it's that we can't live for dead people's expectations. We have to honor them by living fully, not by carrying their burdens." As dawn broke over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they stood together on the headland watching the lighthouse's beam gradually becoming invisible in the growing light. "What will you do with the letters?" Peter asked. "I'll contact the local museum. These are part of Lagos's history. Families might want to know what happened to ancestors who never came home, and the museum can preserve them properly." Miguel paused. "But my grandfather's letter, that one stays with me. And what about you? Will you stay in the lighthouse?" Miguel looked at the cottage, the lighthouse, the ocean that had been his companion for 3 decades. "I think it's time for a change. My wife wouldn't want me spending the rest of my life as a solitary keeper of memories. She'd want me to live, to connect with people, to have new adventures." He smiled at Peter. "Maybe I'll do some traveling myself. There's a world beyond this headland, and I've been afraid to explore it." "Where would you go?" "I have a daughter in Lisbon I haven't visited in 5 years. Grandchildren I barely know. Maybe I'll start there. Rebuild those connections." As Peter prepared to leave later that morning, Miguel gave him a small gift, one of the old coins they'd found in the cave, cleaned and polished. "Something to remember our adventure," Miguel said, "and to remind you that the best treasures are always the connections we make, not the things we accumulate." Peter hugged the old lighthouse keeper, feeling genuine affection for this man he'd known less than 24 hours. "Thank you, Miguel, for sharing your night, your story, and your wisdom." "Thank you, Peter. You helped me find something I thought was lost forever. Hope that it's not too late to change, to grow, to live differently." As Peter walked back toward Lagos, his backpack feeling lighter despite the addition of the coin, he thought about the letters and the bottles and Miguel's grandfather's wisdom about spending life freely on human connection. That's what he was doing now. Traveling not to escape or to fulfill obligations, but to connect with people, places, and experiences. The red lighthouse of Lagos grew smaller behind him, but Peter knew he would remember this night for the rest of his life. not because of any treasure found, but because of the connection made with a lonely lighthouse keeper who had been reminded that it's never too late to choose life over memory, connection over isolation. Thank you for staying with us through this beautiful story. Peter's night at the Red Lighthouse showed that the best adventures don't always involve grand mysteries or dangerous pursuits. Sometimes they're about simple human connection and helping someone find hope again. Miguel discovered that his stern grandfather had loved him all along, hidden in a letter that waited decades to be found. And that discovery gave him the courage to finally leave his isolated lighthouse and reconnect with his family. Peter learned that the journey he's on isn't just about discovering places, but about discovering the value of human connection in a world that often prioritizes wealth and status over relationships and experiences. This is the new chapter of Peter's story, traveling freely through Europe, meeting people, hearing their stories, and occasionally stumbling into small adventures that remind him why he chose freedom over inherited obligation. Where will Peter go next? What other stories and connections await him as he continues his journey through Portugal and beyond? Don't miss the next episode as Peter's backpacking adventure continues. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of this incredible journey.